right. Okay, pull up the notes I sent out today. If you took the test, if you submitted it over the weekend, I was too busy celebrating Captain Pulaski Day, right? Eating pierogies and having like a few of my friends come over to try to put a light bulb in together. So I'll get to it today. I'll put it in Skyward. All right. So just make sure if you haven't got that in, I suggest doing it because it's like 100 points, which is a good chunk of change. Oh, that's cool. Let's see if this works.
It does 30 minutes. Kind of bad. What if you're in a rush?
Yeah, I would know. They come for a while. Usually they're getting better.
Yeah, they kind of suck right now.
Maybe I feel like a second car.
Yeah, that's actually what my I have a big truck. For some reason.
Yeah, that's how they use download.
Wait, the truck's kind of like one of those animal control trucks. So it looks like it looks like a cage. Kind of.
Imagine Dark Knight.
Cage
It's
car.
actually a Dark Knight.
All right. So chapter 9, we're heading back to Europe. So 9 and 10 are actually in Europe. All right. So we're covering the Middle Ages. All right, which you guys may have done a unit when you're in grade school or something on that. Medieval times, right? And so I kind of touched upon this a little bit at the end of chapter 5. Generally, the kind of standard definition for the Middle Ages pertaining to kind of European history is essentially the period right after the fall of the Roman Empire, all right, in Western Europe. In chapter 5, I was talking about the year 476 as generally being the kind of consensus on when the Roman Empire in the West ended. You got to keep in mind, straight the West, right? Because the Eastern Roman Empire, we'll talk about in more detail next when we talk about the Byzantine Empire, right? Based out of Constantinople. To them, the Roman Empire lasted up until the 15th century, until 1453. But here, this is the era that we're kind of talking about. There's a British historian by the name of Edward Gibbon who wrote a book called The Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire. He marked 476, the moment in which the last emperor in the West, that 14-year-old kid Romulus Augustulus, was basically deposed, replaced by a Ostrogoth chieftain by the name of Odoacer or Odoacer. But at that time, people like that would have been, if there was a newspaper, that incident would have been relegated to the back pages. All right. When we talk about how Rome fell, we have this image like the city was caught on fire and all stuff. Now, it was just basically a change of leadership. Right, and like and that the Romans were kind of used to that. There was a lot of kind of turnover. However, it was the kind of Odoacer or Odoacer did not take the title emperor. He informed the emperor of the East that he's essentially the king of England. So that's what they kind of refer to that. Now, the Middle Ages, they tend to historians, and again, our date period here on the chapter, if you notice, was like 400 to 1300. Most historians believe that the Middle Ages starts 500. They round up to 500 to about 1500. All right, and they usually like to break it into 3 eras. Early Middle Ages, which much of chapter 9 is. High Middle Ages, which is the middle part, because saying Middle Ages would sound kind of stupid. That's kind of in the tail end of this chapter. And then the late Middle Ages, which the Renaissance kind of overlaps with. Now, sometimes the early Middle Ages is often referred to as the Dark Ages in Western Europe. This is essentially like 500 up until like after the Viking raids to a certain extent. So, and again, people at this time did not know they were living in the Middle Ages. They didn't know the middle of what. It's essentially termed to being the middle part between the fall of the Roman Empire in the West and the arrival of the Renaissance. All right. The term Dark Ages was actually coined during the Renaissance, the early Renaissance, by a writer by the name of Petrarch, who's considered one of the earliest humanists. All right, who basically kind of advocated for learning kind of Greek and kind of Roman culture and stuff like that. And he looked back at this era and said, these poor stupid fools, they were living in a dark age. All right. Later historians have always kind of tried to say, well, was it that dark? All right. They tried to talk about people like we'll talk about like say Thomas Aquinas and stuff like that. But this is generally the period of the very early kind of Middle Ages. Like I said, the geopolitical world was essentially the Western Roman Empire was divided up amongst these various Germanic or Celtic groups. I kind of talked about this at the end of chapter 5. All right, and so we had like groups like the Ostrogoths, who took over Italy, Odoacer, who was the chieftain who took that title, King of Italy. They took over Italy, parts of southern Gaul. At one point, the Byzantines, we'll talk about this, the Emperor Justinian, basically under his reign, they take over Italy, kind of reunifying the Western and Eastern Empire for a brief period of time. After the Byzantines, another Germanic group comes called the Lombards. The Visigoths take over much of Spain and remain kind of in power on the Iberian Peninsula until the arrival of the Moors, the Muslims, in 711. And then the Franks take over much of what is that kind of northern and western Gaul. That's where we get the word France from. The Franks I'll talk about in more detail on Thursday. They're going to be the ones that come the closest to reunifying Western Europe during the reign of Charlemagne with something called the Holy Roman Empire, which was neither holy nor Roman or really an empire. All right, but we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. And then, for example, like the island of Roman Britannia was essentially divided up by Germanic and Celtic groups. You had the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes who all came from kind of like northern Europe. The Jutes coming from Jutland, which is essentially Denmark. Angles and Saxons. Angles is where we get the term English from. Angles and Saxons at one time are going to kind of like combine cultures and do what we call Anglo-Saxon, which is nowadays a catch-all term for kind of white Northern European culture. And then the Celtic groups of the Picts and the Scots all vying for the northern half of the island. Obviously, the Scots are going to win out that with Scotland in that area. So they're all kind of vying for this kind of area, kind of basically occupying kind of Roman sites and cities and stuff like that. All right. So why do historians kind of refer to this as like kind of like the Dark Ages in a sense? It's kind of tied in with the kind of early Germanic or barbarian rule in some of these parts of Western Europe. So one is we see centralized power, one base in like Rome that controls like through kind of like, basically kind of a system of roads and kind of provinces and stuff like that. That's going to be replaced by local chieftains, like warlords or kings. All right, we start to see kind of like power more vested locally rather than something that's kind of international and regionally in that sense. A lot of this has to do with like all those roads that were kind of leading to Rome. A lot of them were basically kind of unusable. Aqueducts, which fed water into a lot of these Roman cities, are basically kind of like they're non-existent. They were basically used for filler and stuff like that. Those are replaced by well water and stuff. Germanic customs is going to replace Roman law. All right, and so the Romans had a legal system that is somewhat like ours, where you're looking at the evidence at hand. All right, basically, like, you have people that are like testifying and stuff like that. With a lot of these Germanic cultures, they replace that with superstition. All right, and some of that is kind of reflected in somewhat of their kind of violent natures, if you will. A prime example of that would be the concept of Wehrgeld and ordeals. Wehrgeld, which is a German term meaning money for the man. All right, like werewolf, man, wolf there. So in some of these Germanic cultures, violence was a everyday occurrence. So let's say, for example, me and Drew get into an argument. All right, we go to fisticuffs, we're throwing hands. Drew ends up killing me. All right, now depending upon it just happens. Depending upon my status within the tribe or the clan or whatever like that, he'll pay my family like some silver or some portable goods or something like that to make up for the loss. All right, because violence was just kind of an everyday occurrence in a lot of these Germanic cultures. Another one prime example would be the idea of these trials by ordeal, in which the idea of your guilt or innocence is determined based on some type of divine intervention. I know you guys probably don't remember this. Last semester, before chapter 2, when we were talking about Hammurabi's code, the first kind of legal code established by the Babylonians, right? In the video that I kind of showed you guys to introduce the chapter, they had these two Bedouins in northern Iraq, these two dudes that were accused of theft. And to determine their guilt, they had to lick a hot iron spoon. Do you remember that video? And so they took a big spoon, like a big ladle, and they basically kind of shaved it down to where it's smooth, and then they put it over an open flame. And the two dudes licked the spoon. The one guy licked the spoon, didn't blister. The other guy licked the spoon, he had blisters on his tongue. The guy who had blisters on his tongue, he was guilty, because God did not intervene on his behalf. So you would have certain things like the ordeal of the stone, in which basically, let's say I was accused of theft. I said, I didn't do it. Instead of asking people, like saying, hey, no, he was with me, he couldn't have done that. Basically what they did was like, here's a rock. Drop it in a cauldron over an open flame. Let that kind of water heat up, boil. I had to reach my arm down to grab that said rock, pull that rock out, toss it down. wait a while there. The time it would be determined whether minutes or hours or whatever like that. And then if my hand blistered, I was guilty. If it didn't, I was innocent. All right. You would have certain things where people would walk across coals, the ordeal of fire. There's a famous story in which there was Queen Emma, who was a Norman queen who was accused of heresy. She walked across these coals and she was just kind of taking a nice little stroll. Feet didn't blister. Obviously, God intervened on her behalf. All right. You would have things, let's say, I accused, me and Faith basically were accused of the same crime, and we start saying, no, she did it, and she said, I did it, and stuff like that. We would do something called the ordeal of the cross, where basically we'd hold our arms out like this, like a cross, and basically it's like a staring contest. So the first person who dropped their arms was guilty. All right. Most famously was the ordeal of the water, where they would tie a person up. If they would basically toss them, like their legs and their hands, they would toss them into a lake or a river or whatever, usually a lake. And if they came out of it not because they're innocent, but because somebody was like sorcery. If they're kind of accused of witchcraft or sorcery or heresy, that they used their powers to escape. If they stayed submerged, they were obviously innocent. But what's the problem with that?
They were also dead.
They were also probably dead. All right. So you would have these would occur in kind of the early kind of part of the Middle Ages. Did you ever see Monty Python's Holy Grail? There's a scene where they weighed a woman against a chicken or a duck, I think. That was a satire of that, but it wasn't too far off. All right. So some of that, like in Western Europe, while these Germanic groups were kind of replaced Roman law. Another thing is we also start to see, like in some of these places I talked about, like the Middle East and East Asia, we see cities with populations in the hundreds of thousands in some occasions. In Europe, that's not the case in the early Middle Ages. We have cities like London, Paris, Rome that are 10,000 maybe. All right, populations are incredibly small. People start to leave the cities and venture out to the countryside. As a result, we start to see trade and kind of like we see a more agrarian economy. Trade is somewhat limited. This gives the rise to something we'll talk about called feudalism. All right, and then we also see a decline in literacy, the ability to read and write, compared to other parts of the kind of the world, like the Middle East, East Asia, North Africa, and that. And a loss of a common language in particular. What language was the common language spoken in Western Europe during the time of the Roman Empire? Latin. Okay. So here we start to Latin still remains in like the church. All right. In the church, still Latin is still kind of spoken there and used in ceremonies and stuff. But people in their everyday life are getting away from Latin. But we start to see the development of like things like the Romance languages, like Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and the Germanic languages, like obviously German, but Dutch, Swedish, when we talk about Scandinavia, English is a Germanic language. So even like communication becomes even more regional. The world was smaller, basically. People's like they're kind of the world that as they knew it was relatively small in the early Middle Ages. All right. However, like I said, one thing that still kind of remains consistent is the church. All right. Rome itself was almost like kind of in the providence of the popes. Another thing is to try to kind of convert a lot of these Germanic groups to Catholicism. A number of them were Christian, but you have different ways. Like missionaries were a popular way to kind of convert people to Catholicism. Probably the most famous missionary in the early Middle Ages lived at this time, and that's St. Patrick. All right, he's the patron saint of Ireland. His feast day is March 17th, where people dress up in green and drink green beer for whatever. All right. He was part of the Roman world. His family was living in Roman Britannia. The story was he was captured by Celts, taken to Ireland as a slave. He escapes, makes his way to Gaul. There he kind of joins the church, becomes a priest, and then returns to Ireland to basically administer to the Celts. Now, there was initially this idea that the Celts there was no Christianity in Ireland. That's not the case. There was kind of a Celtic form of Christianity, but it wasn't Roman Catholicism. Because of St. Patrick, as the legend goes, because of St. Patrick's missionary work, still to this day, Ireland, the largest Christian denomination, is Roman Catholicism. Right? And so the story was he was able to explain that important concept of the Trinity to the Celts by using the clover leaf, the 3 leaves there, the concept of Father, Son, Holy Ghost. And then there was also stories like he drove out the snakes out of Ireland, which was made up because there was no snakes in Ireland at that time. It was post-glacial Ireland. But the snakes are a metaphor, right? They're a metaphor for paganism. They're a metaphor for Satan and stuff like that. All right. So people like that are going to be elevated in the status for conversion. However, most people of the Germanic and Celtic groups are going to convert if their kind of leaders, their chieftains, their kings, or whatever, convert to Christianity or particularly Catholicism. Prime example of that is Clovis. Clovis is a Merovingian king from the Merovingian dynasty. I'll talk about more detail on Thursday. He's going to unify the big, kind of the main two tribes of the kind of Franks, the Salian and the Ripuarian Franks. Matter of fact, he defeats the last what they call rump state in Europe. Rump states, there was a few of them that after the fall of Rome in 476, there was a few of these kind of Roman provinces that remained kind of like Roman government there. He defeated a guy named Sejanus, who was a Roman general who controlled this region, Soissons, in France. In 496, he takes on another Germanic tribe called the Alemanni. The significance of the Battle of Tobiac is that he is going to defeat the Alemanni, take over their territory, but he prays to the Christian God according to the legend in the middle of the battle, and that turns the tide for him. This is very similar to the Emperor Constantine, who we talked about in chapter 5, who at the Battle of Milvian Bridge turned to the Christian God for his victory. Both Clovis and Constantine aren't basically delving into church doctrine or reading the Bible and stuff like that. This is a deity that helps them win a battle. All right. Now, some other historians claim that he may have converted even before that because his wife Clotilda was a Christian. All right. So soon after this, the Franks are going to be baptized as Roman Catholics, which is significant here because other Germanic groups are Christian, but they're not Roman Catholic. So here's an image of Clovis. We'll talk about the Merovingians a little bit later on Thursday. The name Clovis later, when it becomes kind of Francofied, the French term is Louis for it. So, and Louis is the kind of the French version of Clovis. This is the kind of an illustration of the kind of dramatic battle of the Tobiac, which again is like shows the skies opening up. Again, that's a little bit of embellishment there. This is the baptism of Clovis in a medieval manuscript. This is one a little bit later painting. He was baptized by Saint Regimus in the city of Reims. There's a statue of that incident in outside of Reims. Reims is significant later because up until I believe it's Louis XIV, all French kings, if they were to be legitimate, had to be coronated at Reims, and that dates back to Clovis. All right. And so what we see here is like while the kind of majority of the Germanic, like the Ostrogoths, the Visigoths, the Burgundians, and all these groups, while they're Christians, they're not Catholics. They adhere to a form of Christianity referred to as Arianism, which is named after a theologian from North Africa who lived during the time of the kind of late Roman era named Arius, who separated the divine nature of Jesus and God. At the Council of Nicaea, that was basically determined that God, Jesus, and God are the same entity. All right. So Arianism was kind of popular amongst a lot of these Germanic groups. It made sense to them. All right. Here with Clovis and the Franks converting to Roman Catholicism, what occurs here is a symbiotic relationship where basically the Roman Catholic Church hitches its wagon to the success of the Franks. So whenever the Franks would conquer people, like they defeated later the Visigoths, all right, they later defeat the Burgundians. Whenever they would basically defeat those groups, Roman Catholicism would kind of be the successor religion there. So they essentially, wherever the Franks went, Roman Catholicism went with them as well. All right, so this is an important symbiotic relationship that we see here. Another thing is we also see the emergence of monasteries here for people like basically kind of like emerging as these kind of communities where people could seek sanctuary in like kind of unstable times, but also this was important for the idea of basically kind of living a very pious life. You got to keep in mind that people at this time were concerned about their eternal souls. This is a pre-antibiotic age. All right, you can be healthy one day, sick the next, and dead the very next day in certain occasions. Where your soul is going to go was a big deal. All right, so certain people, a way to try to achieve that was very similar to what we talked about in Hinduism and Buddhism, where the life of the ascetic, the person that would go out and kind of beg and basically kind of get rid of all personal possessions to become closer to enlightenment. All right, same kind of idea. All right, so monasteries served a couple purposes. They served a purpose for the here and now in the sense that it basically gave some people security in an uncertain time, but it also kind of helped with their kind of eternal soul to a certain extent. All right, and so monasteries, a person that, yeah.
Can I go? Bowling gets out a little early.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, go for it. Yeah, I didn't mean to keep it. I thought you were like, I gotta go potty. No, well, good luck. Thank you. Part of the person that's most associated with monasteries is Saint Benedict of Nursia. Benedict was an Italian monk, established as what's considered the first monastery in Mount Cassino in Italy. Benedict also establishes what they call the Benedictine rules, the kind of practical set of rules for monastic life to live in a monastery. So, according to Benedict, monks, you're supposed to remain in the monastery for life. It's a lifelong commitment. Pray 8 times a day. Spend 7 hours a day doing manual labor. Usually, when it comes to like agricultural work, honey, like bees, like beehiving. That was a big part of like a monk's life. Also, breweries. The first breweries in Europe, a lot of them were monasteries. Like Munich, where they have Oktoberfest. München was German meaning monk. All right. So, and people, I just like assume things here. You guys know what beer is? What alcohol is? It's a beverage that adults drink. It usually changes their behavior. Back you'll have to ask your health teachers about it. But back then, people weren't just drinking like ale or mead or wine just to kind of alter their moods. It was also a way to basically it was a safer way to like kind of add water, because drinking straight water at this time, a lot of wells were used. Water was there was a lot of bacteria, so people would get sick from water. Like I said, this was the kind of a little bit of the backwards part of the world here. All right. Also, too, people were monks would spend time reading the Bible, other books and stuff like that. So Benedict is going to outline the kind of how monasteries, like how you're supposed to kind of live a monastic life, if you will. Saint Benedict is one of the patron saints of Europe. We'll talk about the other two when we talk about the Matthias and when we talk about Russia and stuff like that. This is Mount Cassino, all right, where the monastery is. There was a battle in World War II that a lot of it was destroyed and was rebuilt since then. All right. So this dates back to the 6th century, to the 500s, if you will. Also, too, this was a place. Monasteries were also a place where they operated schools, early schools. Like when we talk about feudalism, a number of kind of like kings and nobles would send usually their sons, to be educated, to learn how to read and write, right? Because literacy was relatively low there. Also, they maintained libraries, hand-copied books and manuscripts and stuff. As a result, there's not as many books in Western Europe than there are, let's say, in the Middle East or East Asia, or even like Timbuktu and places like that. But monasteries do kind of maintain some of the intellectual heritage of the kind of Rome. Latin is commonly spoken there and written out there. Another individual that's important is Benedict's twin sister, who adopts a lot of the Benedictine rules for convents, for nuns. Right? She is considered the patron saint of storms. There's a story in which her and her brother were engaging in a heated theological debate, and she wanted the debate to continue. He was visiting her. He had to go home. A storm came, and he ended up having to stay. All right. It seems like kind of a real weak story, but a lot of times people become saints because of certain miracles, and some of these miracles are a little questionable, if you will. All right. There's Scholastica, but again, this was like kind of like convents were also an opportunity for women to get educated. All right, where generally a lot of women weren't educated, unfortunately, like in the Middle Ages. All right, but also too, we start to see another important aspect of the maintaining or spreading the religion is strong leadership at the top of the papacy. All right, and so we start to see the number of popes who served both spiritually and politically. All right, prime example of that would be Pope Gregory the Great, Pope Gregory I. He became Pope in 590. He is going to be the de facto leader of the city of Rome, kind of serve as its mayor for the most part. He used a lot of the tithing money to repair roads, but also do things like charity for the poor, but also raise armies. When we'll talk about how the papacy, in a certain extent, it's going to have its own military presence as well. When we talk about feudalism, we have some kind of bishops and church officials that are have to do kind of military service. He's also important in kind of missionary work. He sends out probably the most famous missionary in England, Saint Augustine of Canterbury, who is responsible for basically making the Angles Roman Catholics. There's a statement which says they're not Angles but angels. All right. Do you guys know anybody music, Gregorian chants? That's where they get the name from, Saint Gregory, Pope Gregory. Whether he Whether he wrote them or was inspired by them is somewhat debatable. But he is a writer. He's what they refer to as kind of a doctor of the church. So there's an illustration of him throwing up deuces, but at the same time holding a book, because he wrote a number of books. Two of the books that are significant, one is called Dialogues, right, which is basically a collection of these stories about basically like a lot of the stories about like kind of missionaries, saints, early martyrs. Most of the information we actually get about Benedict comes from Gregory's Dialogues. All right, and another one was called Pastoral Care, which essentially was a how-to book for bishops, the heads of the kind of local churches, how they're supposed to carry out their spiritual duties to their congregation, but also how they kind of organize their kind of collecting money, how they organize their kind of structure within the kind of local kind of church community. It was a how-to book, if you will. Right. Unfortunately, for a number of priests and stuff like that, not everyone was literate. Sometimes they would have to be dictated to them. Right. But that's why they referred to him as one of the doctors of the church. So what we start to see is Gregory starts that tradition of the popes being kind of political figures as well. All right. And so this is an idea that kind of Gregory lays out in this concept referred to as Christendom. This idea that anywhere there's Roman Catholics, the Pope's authority should supersede that of any secular king, all right, or noble. This is going to be a constant underlying theme throughout the chapter, right? Who has more power, church or state? And the scales at times are shifting. So during the time of Pope Gregory, it appears that kind of the papacy has more power. In the time of Charlemagne, which we'll talk about Thursday, it appears kings have more power, all right? Because Charlemagne literally has to save a number of popes from basically being overthrown and such. All right. So that's going to be something that's going to be kind of a theme throughout the chapter. All right. So tomorrow I'm going to do a little kind of web quest thing from this website. I'll post a link to it. And it's got like 20-something questions. All right. Just got to kind of find the answers throughout the website. All right. And then on Thursday, we'll start talking about the Franks in more detail. Do you guys get this at home?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Anybody not get this?
I'm just kidding.
Okay, cool. All right. I'll see you guys tomorrow.